Hey, Toby. Thanks for joining me.
Hey, great to be with you, George.
So you've been in very dangerous situations. I'm curious, did you feel that you were in more danger embedded in the Middle East or when we were bicycling across Finland and Sweden?
Well, sometimes in those sort of lonely moments when I was at the bottom of a big hill and there was these huge Scandinavian trucks heading towards me, it did feel a bit hairy. But, probably Iraq and Afghanistan, I'd say.
Yeah, I should say so. Although we did have our bike stolen in Stockholm, if you remember. So
yes, that's right.
That was a bit hairy.
Yeah.
So I wanted to talk a bit about your book. I think I always think that there's so many lessons that the business world can learn from special forces, and just to be honest, just us as humans. And I want to learn a bit about your process. But I figured maybe one interesting place to start would be in researching your book, First Casualty, and writing it. Did it change anything about you in the way that you approach relationships or life or problems? Is there anything that fundamentally changed as you went through that process?
I'm sure it did. I mean, at the core of this story, there are sort of 8 men from CIA Team Alpha who was paramilitaries, but also case officers, linguists, and there was a medic and there was a Green Beret. And then alongside them at the beginning was ODA 595, who were 12 Green Berets, led by a captain of different specialisms, like weapons, intelligence, medics, comms. And so they were 2 teams of sort of incredible variety of very sort of high-functioning people who were older than the average, certainly military person in Afghanistan. In the CIA, some of them were in their late 40s. The sort of median was probably late 30s.
So there's hope for some of us old guys.
Exactly, yeah. Well, not quite for me now, but they were just sort of incredible people. And so, there's stereotypes about the military and even about the CIA. But what really struck me and I think really affected me was how different people can be and what different skill sets they can have, yet they can still all point in the same direction. They can complement each other and work towards a common aim. And in fact, that variety of people means that these sorts of teams that are going into very unfamiliar situations can adapt and improvise. So I think I learned a lot about that.
I was really impressed by the diversity of background. I think one of the guys, he had an archaeology background, and there was just such a mix. And I feel like sometimes in business we're looking for this finely tuned, has the exact right background that we think, but you get such pleasant surprises by these people with philosophy backgrounds, and it could be anything really. It's that diversity of thought that they bring to the table that I think brings so much value.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I guess I expect, so Mike Spann, who was the first casualty in combat after 9/11, was a former Marine Corps officer who was very much, I feel like, in a way, the sort of the personification of America after 9/11. With us or against us, black and white. Let's go kill the bad guys. Let's take care of business. He was a much more sort of nuanced person than that, and I think if he was 32 and he was killed, if he lived, he probably would have developed into a very fine, very senior CIA officer, would have learned languages, would have become a sort of case officer, a traditional spy. But as alongside Mike Spann, David Tyson, who was with him with Mike Spann when he was killed on November 25th, 2001, and had to shoot himself out of an Al Qaeda uprising inside a dusty fort. I mean, he had spent 4 years living in Central Asia. He was a former academic. He was a polyglot, knew all these Central Asian languages. He was so close to going native at one point that he didn't own a pair of shoes. He had served in the military, but he was sort of the least militarily experienced of the 8 of them. And yet when it came down to it, he was the guy who was faced with this sort of kill or be killed situation, and he survived. He killed several dozen Al Qaeda guys getting out of there. So this also taught me a lot about somebody, if you met David in the Giant or Food Lion or whatever, you wouldn't give him a second thought. Completely sort of unassuming guy, and even if you started talking to him, he doesn't come across as sort of Navy SEAL elite warrior type. Yet the core, his inner core was, when the moment presented itself, he stepped up and he did what he had to do. So it's also, you see the picture of the Team Alpha guys in K2 in Uzbekistan before they were flying and standing outside a Black Hawk helicopter. And there are lots of jokes which they all enjoy about, they look like dads on a fishing trip, or middle-aged guys going camping. And they didn't have body armor or helmets. They didn't have any military gear, so they got stuff from REI. REI did some pretty good business in Northern Virginia in 2001, or just sort of camping stuff that they had in their closets. And so very very unlike sort of what came to be later on in these wars with sort of sleeve tattoos and sunglasses and cool gear and very sort of slick equipment. They didn't have any of that, but they were successful and they got the job done.
It's amazing what's possible when you just put together the right collection and mixture of people into a team. I'm one thing I'm really curious about, Toby, is your first book, Bandit Country. You were with the IRA. Second book is with the Welsh Guard, and now this one with CIA and Special Forces. Like, you seem to have a knack to get folks to trust you that are probably, if I made a top 10 list of people who don't earn trust easily, or don't grant trust easily, it would be those folks. And I'm curious, what is your process? How do you go about getting into their world deeply so quickly and earning trust so quickly?
Well, yeah, I've thought about this a lot. It's not a trick. There's not a formula. And I think what happens is over time, over your entire life and your sort of career, you're at this point of you're the sum of all these different experiences. Mm-hmm. I think, having been in the military myself, so I was in the Royal Navy in the UK for nearly 10 years. So I joined in 85 and left in 94. And in the middle of that, I had a scholarship through college paid for by the Navy. I think the time I spent in Iraq and Afghanistan, sort of as an embedded reporter and as a sort of unilateral reporter, the time I spent in Northern Ireland, I think, I'm I'm 56 years old now. I've had quite a few experiences. I've had setbacks in my life that I've sort of overcome, and I feel that, when you're meeting somebody for the first time, you sort of bring all that to the table. And then also I think what I've learned to do increasingly as I've got older is I've learned to listen, and yes, sort of ask questions, but to let it play out. Let people talk about what they want to talk about often. And a huge aid for me in this has been AI transcription. So I use Otter, and there are other apps. But for the first two books, so the first book, Bandit Country, was 99. The second book was Dead Men Risen, was 2011, and then this one was 2021. And so for the first two, I was working off. Well, the first one I was working off physical C90 tapes, so you had to rewind and go. And the second one was, USB audio files, via USB. But both times I had to get them transcribed. And so I'd either do it myself, which was incredibly time consuming.
Painful.
Yeah. Or I'd subcontract it out. I'd pay people. With Dead Men Risen, I had lots of sort of mostly, older ladies in Britain doing it for me because they had to transcribe mainly British accents, and it was very time consuming. It cost me a lot of money. But now I can do with First Casualty, I can do 4 or 5 hour interviews. We can go off on a tangent for an hour, and it's fine because I just plug it in, and Otter will do 80-90% accurate transcription. And so what I've also found is that these tangents, they may seem irrelevant, and often they are, but that's fine. But they can lead to really interesting places and really interesting material that I didn't expect. And I also think that it's just kind of good manners and polite and puts people at ease. If you're not seen to be just trying to get something from them, like a particular thing, like you're fixated. I just want to tell you about this. You're a sniper. I'm only interested in how many people you killed, for instance. And I've worked in sort of team situations with journalists. I mean, I generally have tried to avoid them, but sometimes I've been doing a joint interview, and I find it unbelievable the way some journalists can just interrupt people, how rude they can be, how they can sort of cut people off, how they can, do the opposite of building a rapport, actually alienate people. But
the bar set so low. It's such a bummer that the bar set so low. I love chasing the tangents. I find, and I should probably pause here for a second and say, I'm drawing many parallels between business world and special forces and what these folks do, but I'm by no way saying that we're anywhere related to what these heroes do, putting their lives on the line. I think there's just a lot of lessons to be learned.
I feel the same way as a journalist. I mean, I've been in some dangerous situations and stuff, but nothing compared to, special forces or special operators or CIA paramilitaries over the last 20 years.
Yeah, and one thing I was really, and because I do find myself in that situation, and when we're going in as consultants, you're fresh and you're talking to these folks, and you want to get them to open up to you, and sometimes if you just give enough space, I find that they just start to say more and more and more until you eventually get, after a while, to the real deep human stuff and all the maybe pain that they've experienced in their job, and that only happens if you meander for a while and you're comfortable meandering for a while.
I mean, as a journalist, when you're out in a place, there's a big, you get a lot of sort of kudos, I guess, or credit for shared experience. Like you're there, you put yourself in harm's way the same as the soldier. And when you're in I certainly found this, when people are in a situation where they might die, anybody might die the next day, but it's a real strong possibility they might die in the next day or the next few weeks. People talk about things they don't usually talk about, and also a bit like if you're sort of the chaplain or you're, or I don't know, some contractor. As a journalist, you're an outsider. You're not in the chain of command. And so there is a sort of confessional aspect to it sometimes, where people will just sort of open up to you because you're sort of, you're slightly to one side. You've got a slightly different perspective.
The safe space. I find that as well. The other trend that I saw in your book and in this story in general was this constant kind of bucking of the slow-moving machine, or the bucking of the bureaucracy. The story I was really drawn to was just that September 13th presentation where, the more conventional generals were saying, that we're going to take several months to even come up with a plan, blah, 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 blah. But then who was it with the CTC was saying...
Kofa Black.
We have our plan. We're ready to go. We're ready to go right now. And that in itself it seemed to give that confidence to say, okay, you guys run with this.
I was curious. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just curious your observations of that, because there's a balance between, flying off half-cocked versus already being prepared and being nimble and being able to move. And it's so relevant to what's happened over the past couple of years. I was curious your observations as you dug into those areas.
Yeah, I vividly remember 9/11. I was in Washington, D.C., and I know you do as well. There was this sense of urgency that we can't just wait. We have to get ahead of this, because if we just wait, there'll be another attack. And we didn't. There was a sense of. I remember on the night of September the 11th. There were Humvees on the corner of Washington, D.C. streets. And it was like, is the next attack going to be tomorrow, or is it going to be next week? So there was this sort of real urgency. And the CIA is a small organization with these small teams of people who would just get things done. We'll work it out on the ground. And Bush went for it. And it was incredibly successful in those early months. We forget now that the Taliban was toppled and most of Al-Qaeda was expelled from Afghanistan in a matter of, of a couple of months. And there's incredible authority delegated. So, J.R. Seeger, who was he was a GS-15 at the time, so it's kind of a colonel equivalent. in military terms. He was Team Alpha Chief, but I mean, he was making sort of tactical decisions, but decisions with strategic consequences, just on his own. Now it changed. I mean, it was very sort of flat, devolved structure at that time, and that was not the story of the rest of the war. But yeah, I mean, it was fascinating to me how kind of liberated these guys felt, because they were able to make their own decisions. And obviously, you know, sometimes they weren't the right decisions with hindsight, or, you know, mistakes were made. But also there was an incredible amount done that couldn't have been done if they'd had to have had authority from sort of 3 levels higher than them. Yeah,
you're at least moving in the general direction of doing something rather than just sitting around thinking about it. I was amused how you wrote about how Rumsfeld was kind of lambasting his generals for not having any imagination or creativity as they were coming up with plans. And you know, in my world, I always get frustrated. Anytime there's a new leap in technology, I find that there's so few people, like, they just keep taking the same thing that they had before and then applying it to the new technology, rather than reimagining and kind of re-envisioning what can be done. And you know, I was curious, you know, what did you see in this team that gave them the ability to just constantly reimagine and think differently on their feet?
I think a lot of experience from different realms. So I mentioned sort of academia. There was a Marine. The deputy chief, Alex Hernandez, was a sergeant major who'd been 20 plus year career in special forces, ended up on a special mission unit. J.R. Seeger had worked with the Mujahideen against the Russians in the 1980s. And so they all brought different things to the table. There was no, I mean, JR was definitely the chief and Alex was definitely the number 2, but it was very much a sort of consensus model. I mean, there was some tension, not very much, and almost entirely sort of creative. The other thing was, these people were used to, risk, and they were comfortable with risk, and they knew on some level that, you know, some or all of them might die, and indeed Mike Spann did. They were also ready to sort of operate individually or in smaller units than 8. In fact, they very rarely operated as 8. They tended to operate in 3s or even 2s sometimes. And so I think it was just that sort of flexibility. I mean, they knew the 2 of them, David and JR, knew the languages and knew the culture, but they were ready to work, to not look for problems, but look for solutions, and not say we can't do this, we have to do it, we're going to find a way to do it.
It's interesting because in large organizations, consensus-driven decisions has almost become a bad word, because it can slow things to a halt. But that one point that you said in that team is they all have a shared level of risk that they're willing to take on. You know, I think a lot of times when you're trying to get consensus within a group, if you got varying levels, especially very large varying levels of risk tolerance, that's when the consensus decision just grinds to a halt, right? Because you just can't get any agreement.
Right, and I found that as a journalist. So as a journalist, say unilaterally in Iraq, for instance, you tend to find 1 or 2 other people who you can sort of operate with, and they generally speaking, they tend to. You don't want them to be competitors, so you don't want to be working for the Telegraph along with the Times of London, unless you really have to, because then you produce the same thing. But you want people who who can sort of offset your tendencies. So I have a tendency, or I certainly had a little bit, to be, I wouldn't say reckless, but to sometimes dismiss things that were signs of danger. So I would.
Some might call that reckless.
maybe. But I have a tendency to be like, you know what, it's probably going to be okay. And so I want somebody who was a little bit more cautious than me, but not significantly more. Because if it's significantly more, then you want to go do. I wanted to go do stuff, but it was useful to me to have somebody who maybe would just say, "Hey, let's just take I want to do it, but let's just take a step back and let's work it out." And then there's also just some people are good at technology, some people are good at map reading, and so I would sort of seek out people that I was in the same bracket as, but could maybe help me with some of the things that I knew were potential weaknesses. And presumably with some other people, they might have thought, well, he's prepared to go do stuff and he's not completely reckless, and maybe he'll push me to the edge of my comfort zone, and that will be good. So that was very important. And I mean, I've thought about this a lot with when people were getting captured and beheaded by ISIS, because I remember one particular sort of pairing, and I thought that's just terrible pairing. Like, those two guys were both incredibly reckless, and they were probably in a recklessness arms race when they were operating together, and that's what you really, really don't want. So yeah, but it's very important to sort of choose who you sort of operate with in those environments.
Yeah, there's that gap between just balancing you out versus like either dragging you down or throwing you into the depths of hell, I suppose.
Yeah. I mean, I remember occasions when, there were huge teams, group situations, which I generally didn't like. I remember in Najaf in 2004, and, there were too many people. So there's too much of a range of sort of risk tolerance. And so literally, I remember one occasion when sort of 6 people got into a vehicle, and then one person in the middle suddenly just didn't feel comfortable with it and wasn't going to go, and we all had to get out, and they got out and stayed, and it was just crazy. And I was just like, at this point I just want to walk and go and do it.
It's funny. I always like to bring those stories back to just normal day-to-day stuff. I think anyone can relate if you've ever been maybe on vacation or hanging out with like more than 8 people. Maybe it's family or friends. You're in a ski house. You're right. Whatever, and you're just trying to decide where to go to dinner, and you can't. So at some point, you just have to say, "I'm going. We're probably going to go to one of 3 places. If you guys want to come with me, that's great. If you don't. Like, we're gonna go get dinner somewhere. Otherwise, it would never even happen." Yeah,
absolutely. And very much day to day. Who's prepared to drive in the snow? And who just wants to stay at home? You see it with COVID and risk tolerances and behaviors. So it's just a part of life.
Yeah, and so Team Alpha, it seemed like such a great recipe of a team. Do you have any insight on like what was that formulation process of assembling that team?
Well, so it was interesting. So, I think, Kofa Black, who is the chairman of the Counterterrorism Center, who's a very sort of, I interviewed him for the book, and he lives pretty near to me, and so I see him occasionally. Kind of a storied career as a spy in Africa, chasing Carlos the Jackal. He was targeted by bin Laden himself, and very kind of theatrical, and he was the one who said to Bush, when this is over, there are going to be flies walking across their eyeballs. Mm-hmm. So Kofa Black, and then his deputy Hank Crompton, who was the station chief in Canberra, who just arrived in Australia and got turned around after 9/11, and Hank Crompton sort of ran the war sort of day to day. They chose the teams, and so the early teams, I think they looked very carefully at the sort of balance of personality. So the first team to go in was Jawbreaker, which went into the Panjshir Valley, I think September the 26th. That was sort of in friendly territory, Northern Alliance controlled territory, and they chose Gary Schroen, who was like a lieutenant general equivalent in the CIA, very senior guy, 60 years old, was in the process of retiring. And they were sort of older, more experienced hands. With Team Alpha, I think they knew they were their first team behind enemy lines, so military experience was very important. But, I think they thought about it very carefully. And, the balance between JR and Alex Hernandez, for instance, so JR was a few years younger. He'd been an officer in 82nd Airborne, Ranger, qualified. Alex was the classic NCO, so he he's going to enforce the rules. He's going to make sure his thing was like, let's not do stupid stuff. And then he modified to that, let's not do very stupid stuff. But he was the one.
It's a good rule.
Yeah. Security, safety. But JR was the person with sort of the vision and the language and the knowledge of the tribes. But, as you all know, in a sort of military context, the senior officer, the team leader, will often defer or certainly listen to the greater experience and sort of military prowess of the senior NCO. I mean, it's just a classic relationship, and that was the sort of the heart of the team, and then you have sort of David Tyson, who's a little bit of an outlier because 40 years old at the time, relatively new into the CIA, the sort of academic background, less military, but this very deep sort of bond with the Afghans. And I've heard, this was the team that I focused on, but I've heard of sort of some tension and some teams where the dynamics just didn't work later on, that they were sort of more thrown together. But with this team, it was sort of almost seamless, and I don't think that was by accident.
Mm. I'm always blown away. There's the classic advice. You want to make sure you put the right people in the right seats, and I'm always blown away at how simple that sounds, but how incredibly difficult that is to actually make happen.
If one of those 8 had been just a bad fit, the whole thing would have been very different.
That's interesting. Yeah, just like one tiny little bit off, right? And it's the effect of a butterfly wing. You talked how they had a shared kind of alignment on the risk tolerance. You talked about how you are kind of innately, how some may or may not call reckless, or were when you were younger. The one thing that's common within these folks and yourself, quite honestly, is being comfortable, or maybe not comfortable, but being able to live in a world of unexpectedness.
Yeah.
And I'm curious, with these folks and other folks that you've interviewed and just your observations of life, like how much of that do you think is just in your, born into you as your ability to be comfortable in unexpectedness versus being able to learn that skill or be able to adapt to it? Because I feel in ever-changing times, it's a skill set that more and more people need to learn.
Yeah. Well, I think it's both. Certainly from my perspective, I'm 4th generation military. I had a great grandfather that was captured in France in 1914, escaped from POW camp in Germany in 1916. I grew up with my grandfather from, World War II, showing me his medals and talking about, his experiences and talking about his regiment's experiences at Rorke's Drift, which was part of the movie Zulu. And I grew up in Manchester, in the northwest of England, sort of grim industrial city, sort of like the Detroit of England or something. And so I always wanted to get out, and it just felt oppressive and insular. And this is a very common, kind of feeling, I think, when you talk to people who join the military. In fact, I was speaking to a guy yesterday who was in Vietnam, African American, living in segregated South Carolina, and he just talked to me about in 1957, sitting on his stoop, just dreaming of getting out of South Carolina, of getting out of the United States, going to Africa, going to Asia, and that's what he spent his life doing, and that was sort of something in him. I think it is also something you learn, and so I had twice when I was a kid, when I was 9, we moved from the south of England to the north of England. So my accent was very different. I kept on getting called posh, and I had lots of fights. Then I moved from into sort of central Manchester when I was 14. And so both times I had this experience of going into a new school and taking a deep breath and thinking like, okay, so it's going to be a tough week or two, but it's going to be fine, and I need to identify, who's going to be an ally, who to avoid, and you just sort of work it out. And it was in some ways it was a sort of daunting. Both of those things were daunting experiences, and I envy people who have lived in the same place throughout their life, throughout their childhood, and know kids from when they were 4 to when they were 18. And I didn't have that. But on another level, I think it definitely taught me a lot of skills for sort of adapting, and also it's kind of exhilarating as well. It's just like a completely new start. Like, so that image I had before, or those kind of difficult relationships or whatever, those are in the past now. I can just sort of start again. And I found as a naval officer, when you join a new ship, 250 people, you maybe know 2 or 3, and you eventually get to know all of them, and you have to sort of make your mark and find your way. And people often sort of say, oh, it must have been really different going from the military to journalism. And in some ways, yes, but in many ways not. Because as a journalist, you're always going into unfamiliar situations. You always got like, oh, who's this guy? Can we trust him? Is he an idiot? Is he going to get us killed? Is he just going to be arrogant? And you have to, you have to find the people who are going to be helpful, avoid the people who just don't want you to be there and are just going to sort of stop you doing things. And so, I think, my background and those childhood experiences sort of have helped me in going into unfamiliar situations, as an adult.
The interesting common thread through all those is that that ability to embrace ever-changing environments happens because of necessity. And now we're in a time where technology is ever-changing, society is quickly evolving or devolving, who depending on who you talk to. Yeah. And there's a lot of folks, I think, that are in business and in life that are saying, hey, I'm not used to things changing this quickly, and I'm uncomfortable. And I guess part of me was hoping, like, hey, can these people kind of get in the emotional gym and work out and prepare for that? Or is it just, once they face it, it's just going to become necessary at some point, and you'll find that it's not as hard as it is once you actually face the uncertainty. Maybe that's it.
Yeah, I mean, it's both of those things. I mean, I think, I have 2 kids who are now both teenagers and, live in Northern Virginia, and you want to push them. I want to sort of push them to, take risks.
The tough streets of Northern Virginia.
Yeah, exactly. Don't just go with the flow. Don't just believe something because that's what everyone is saying. And, it's the world we live in now, it's sort of harder to do that. But at the same time, there's incredible opportunities to extend yourself. So, I think there's such pressure now to sort of conform, to not say anything that may be sort of different or a risk, to sort of keep within kind of ever narrowing sort of tracks of what's sort of acceptable opinion. And so I think the people who, while obviously being sensitive to societal change and people's, comfort levels, and, you have to sort of navigate all that. But the people who can do that and can also say, you know what, I think everyone else is maybe wrong on this. I'm going to try something different. Those people are going to be the leaders and success stories of the future.
Bravery and imagination trumps all the time. So we talked a little bit about advice for others, advice for your children. One thing I always like to end on is, in your life, what's the best advice you've ever received?
Okay, so a couple of things. My father died just 2 years ago. And there's a couple of things, and we had a relationship that was ended up being very good, but it certainly had its ups and downs. And I think we sort of, in some ways, we sort of clashed sometimes because we were quite similar. But he taught me, a number of things when I was a kid, and two things sort of stand out. One was, if a thing's worth doing, it's worth doing properly. And he used to really get on my nerves, as I'd sort of, bring the wood in or whatever, and I hadn't quite brought in enough wood, or I hadn't stacked it properly, or I just kind of I just kind of thought, well, that's good enough. And so for him, if a thing's worth doing, it's worth doing it properly, and that has stuck with me. So go the extra mile. Talk to the extra person just to check that that's correct. Don't think, oh well, that I tick the box by doing that interview. No, what did you find out from it? Could you go back? Did you really get to what that person, that sort of essence of that person, or everything that person has to offer? So that, and the other thing, which has sort of been cited against me sometimes, but it's, he said to me, rules are for the guidance of wise men and the obedience of fools. And so that's been thrown back at me sometimes. It's like, oh, you just don't believe in rules. You're just a rebel, and you don't care about rules. No, it didn't mean that. And my dad had, explained it to me, and I remember we were in this little sort of village in Wales, and he said, if there was a sign, we're at the top of a hill. He said, if there was a sign there that said no prams beyond this point, and then you saw, a mother trip up and the pram with a baby in it started rolling down the hill, would you look at the sign and say, "Oh, no prams beyond that point. They've broken a rule. I'm not gonna run and catch that pram, because then I'll be with a pram beyond the sign where prams aren't allowed." And he was like, "No, of course you wouldn't. You'd run after the pram. It doesn't mean you're dismissing the rule or you're ignoring it. You're taking it into account, but there are other circumstances that override it." And I think it was a pretty good lesson, and I took it to heart. As a journalist, often you're told, no, you can't do this. No. And if every time you're told no, you don't do it, then you're never going to do anything. Or you're not allowed this visa because, you have to apply 2 weeks in advance. Well, I want the visa anyway, or I'm in a country where I can maybe give a gift of, 2 Benjamins to the customs officer, and he's going to let me across the border. So I'm breaking a rule, And I've obviously talking to CIA people who break rules all the time, while also adhering to a kind of an ethical code. So anyway, so that's something that really stuck with me. That yes, be aware of rules, and don't just recklessly ignore them, but adhere to them judiciously, because there are times when you need to break the rules.
Those are great. I know I wish I could rewind time and not be annoyed with my parents when they gave me advice like that.
Right. Me too.
Well, Toby, First Casualty is a fantastic read. I encourage all out there to buy it and read it and recommend it. It's a great story for many reasons: human reasons, history reasons, strategy, you name it. It really covers all the bases. Thanks so much for being here, Toby.
Well, thanks very much. And by the way, I think your bikes were stolen, but I still got my bike from that 2005 trip. It's in the garage. Should get out and use it a little bit more.
Nice. Great seeing you, Toby.
All right. Likewise.